Mm. Thank you, Ruth. It's lovely to see you. I want to try, look, this is me, so pray for me. I want to try and speak for slightly less than normal. Um, but we've got a whole chapter of 1 Corinthians, so I'm not making any promises. Today we're looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 14, which is the culmination of a huge chunk of this letter. And I must admit, as we come to this chapter, I find it all a little bit of an anticlimax. Last week, we looked at 1 Corinthians 13, which is probably one of the most famous parts of the Bible, whether you're a Christian or not. And that's this incredible hymn to love, the nature of love, which even after 2,000 years, we see as such a brilliant encapsulation of what real love is about. It's still something that we share, and Paul continues in this chapter to apply this. Now, how would you apply love? What would be the ways that you would want to live out love? It might be, in service of your neighbor. It might be in service of your country or your family. But no, it's about how to have church meetings. It's not what I was expecting. We have reached the mountaintop with chapter 13, and now it feels like we're having a sit down and a little sandwich. But actually, this is where Paul has been taking us for several chapters, all the way back to chapter 11, when he says, this stuff that I've heard about you is really not very good. And all of these chapters hold together. This is where dividing letters into chapters becomes a bit of a problem, because for 4 chapters, Paul has been deconstructing the way that the Corinthians are meeting together. And it's clearly got under his skin. The next chapter, chapter 15, is the nearest thing that we've got in the letter to a bit of consistent theology, looking at the theology of the resurrection, and we'll do that next week. And then the final chapter is a traditional summing up in a letter of its day. But we're listening to one side of a conversation, so we have to try to imagine what it is that Paul has heard, either directly from them or through kind of gossip, however that worked in those days. And Paul really thinks that they have a problem. It's not a problem that we have as a church at the moment. There might be some of us that would like to have this problem. We do not have this problem. So we need to kind of reverse engineer this chapter so that it is of use to us. We do not have a problem of everyone simultaneously speaking in tongues and too many people prophesying over each other, so that the meeting is fairly chaotic and no one really knows what's going on. And if anyone came in and saw us, they would go, who are these crazy people? We're all far too English for that. And of course, we can go online and we can see Christians doing this stuff. One of my favorite YouTube videos is of a well-known faith healer who has been given a lightsaber by some video editor. And instead of kind of laying hands on people and they fall over in the spirit, he's whacking them with a lightsaber. I wouldn't at all advise you to go search for that on YouTube, ever. Or at least not till I finish speaking anyway. And Paul is concerned not only with whether this kind of meeting builds us up, that's his phrase. We get the word edify from that. Whether this is really building up the community, he is also concerned with what a visitor is going to make of what's going on. Now, as I say, we don't really have that problem as a church. Um, if people visit us, they'll probably go, "Oh, they're lovely," rather than, "Oh, they're crazy." Uh, but there's still stuff that I think we need to learn. But in a sense, for us, it's about the pendulum going the other way. There are some different indications in this chapter about what the meetings were like, what the size was, because we know from chapter 11 that people gathered after work to eat together pretty much every night, as far as we can tell. And rich people either didn't work or knocked off work early, and slaves and lower class workers came late, and there was no food left for them. So you're talking about a reasonable sized group of people, and yet in this section Paul talks about each one bringing something to the meeting. The idea that everyone can bring a gift from God to share with the community. So it can't have been totally massive. Now, I don't think when Paul says each one, he means that everyone had to take it in turns having a prophecy. I think he just meant that each of us could make a contribution. So maybe the church in Corinth was around Chapel A size, maybe a little bit smaller, maybe a little bit bigger. So maybe there's something about how we meet here as a community, and what it is for God to speak to us and through us. But as I say, we are probably in a different place to this community in terms of what we need to do to get ourselves in that sweet spot. So we need to almost listen to the opposite of Paul's advice to the Corinthians. I just want to mention an elephant in the room because I'm going to completely ignore a couple of verses, because that's a whole separate talk, and I'm sure Charlotte will address those verses. Towards the end, there's a couple of verses about women being silent and having to go home and ask their husbands what things mean. I'm not going to address those verses in this talk, except to say that it can't possibly mean what it appears to mean, because just 3 chapters ago, Paul was talking about what women need to do when they're prophesying. So clearly, keeping silent doesn't mean not prophesying. As I say, we can't go into that. Feel free to ask me, or even better, Charlotte, what that's all about outside of this meeting. So today I have got a bit of PowerPoint, but it's not very exciting because we're just going to read the text together, and we're going to just consider what it is that God might be saying to us today. It's a text essentially about God working in us and through us to build up the community. And as I say, the Corinthians' problem seems to be that there's just a flood of gifts of the Spirit. We have a trickle at best. So we need to be thinking more about how we get that flow becoming consistent. But I hope you'll see that Paul has got some advice for us that is going to help us in that department. Okay, so I just want to remind us all of some of the major themes. The fact that when we hear you, it's nearly always a plural you. And this notion of the body, we've heard it over and over again, culminating in the big chunks of chapter 12, in which Paul is using that metaphor for a body. It's great. He talks about all the gifts being important. Now he's going to undermine his whole argument by saying that some gifts are more important than others in the context of meeting together. So I'm going to read some bits of this and hopefully you will get the general gist of it. Okay. this is starting from the start of chapter 14. Pursue love and strive for the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy. For those who speak in a tongue do not speak to other people, but to God. For nobody understands them, since they are speaking mysteries in the Spirit. On the other hand, those who prophesy speak to other people for their building up and encouragement and consolation. Those who speak in a tongue build up themselves, but those who prophesy build up the church. Now, I would like all of you to speak in tongues, but even more to prophesy. One who prophesies is greater than one who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets, so that the church may be built up. I just want to say a couple of things about this passage. This idea of building up, edifying, just comes up over and over again. So when we're thinking about what the point of making room for the Spirit is in our meetings, it's something about building up this community, strengthening this community. The verse that I've highlighted, now I would like all of you to speak in tongues, but even more to prophesy, is really, really hard. It's really hard to translate, because that first verb that he uses, about I would like all of you to, is a really, really slippery verb. Greek people, you really weren't very helpful. The verb basically goes all that can be used to go all the way from I tolerate it to I really, really like it. So I would prefer to kind of aim in the middle. Most of the translators say it's at one end of like, I really like this, but I think in this argument it makes more sense for Paul to be saying, I'm absolutely fine with you speaking in tongues. I think that's great, but even more, I want you to prophesy. And I'm going to miss out a little bit, because he then uses lots of illustrations to explain why he thinks that prophecy is more important. But then he says it more clearly in kind of plain Greek or English for us. Therefore, one who speaks in a tongue should pray for the power to interpret. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unproductive. I don't know how many of you pray in tongues. For me, it happens it happens regularly in two specific situations. One is the other day, most of you will know that I have a chronic illness, which means I'm in pain of varying degrees all the time. Anna woke up with a really bad migraine. So we were lying in bed, praying for each other. And I didn't really know what to pray. And Paul says, sometimes the Spirit prays when we don't really know what to pray. So I was praying in tongues at that point, frankly, because I didn't know what to pray. As someone who's had pain constantly for 2 years, it's difficult to have the faith to pray that it will go away. But I wanted to pray for Anna, so I prayed in tongues. There's also a context in worship where I feel kind of caught up in the Spirit, and I feel that there's a kind of heart-to-heart connection, or in the Old Testament, the image of deep calling to deep. So sometimes praying in tongues is a kind of connection that happens between me and God without my mind being involved. Now, Paul doesn't think that is enough on its own. If I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unproductive. What should I do then? I will pray with the Spirit, but I will pray with the mind also. I will sing praise with the Spirit, but I will sing praise with the mind also. Like I say, for us, I think the pendulum is swinging the other way. So for many of us today, what we need to hear is, I pray with my mind, but I will pray with my spirit also. I will sing praise with my mind, but I will sing praise with my spirit also. For some of us, that connection with God, whether that is through worship, through more contemplative prayer, through seeking silence, going on retreat, we need to acknowledge that worship and prayer cannot just be a mental thing. We need to be open to that deep spiritual stuff. If we're someone that finds the spiritual connection easier, Paul says, don't just switch off your mind. Otherwise, if you say a blessing with the Spirit, he's, talking about praying in tongues. How can anyone in the position of an outsider say the amen to your thanksgiving, since the outsider doesn't know what you're saying? You may give thanks well enough, but the other person is not, and it's that phrase again, built up. I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you. Nevertheless, in church, I would rather speak 5 words with my mind in order to instruct others also than 10,000 words in a tongue. So this is about when we gather. This isn't saying that the gift of tongues is more or less valuable than the gift of prophecy. He's simply saying that when we are together, the primary focus is not what's my spiritual experience. How do I feel? What did God bless me by the end of the meeting? The question is, did I bless the meeting? That's our measure of a good meeting. Did I build up this community? Later in the chapter, Paul says, if the whole church comes together and all speak in tongues, and outsiders or unbelievers, then you can imagine this happening, can't you? Get your lightsabers out. Outsiders or unbelievers enter. Will they not say that you're out of your mind? But if all prophesy, an unbeliever or outsider who enters is reproved by all. That's a polite word, for saying challenged. So prophecy isn't always just my children, I love you. And called to account by all. After the secrets of the unbeliever's heart are disclosed, what nowadays we might call a word of knowledge, that person will bow down before God and worship him, declaring God is really among you. So when we meet and invite others to join us, we want people to go, wow, not just you're really nice people, but God is really among you. On Friday, I went for a walk with an old friend who describes themselves as a Christian, but isn't currently regularly part of a community. And they said, for me, the thing that I am looking for is to share my brokenness with others, for them to lay hands on me and for God to heal me, for God to meet me in my brokenness. And I was really, really surprised. This person, went to university, has a first in an art subject, very, very intelligent, creative person. But their reflection on their experience of church was, all the intellectual stuff is fine, but I can get that from all over the place. The thing that I can't get, and the reason I'm not coming to your church, is because I don't think I will get that. I don't think, if I turn up, will you help me encounter God? Will I leave your meeting going, God is really among you? So I was really, really challenged by that. And for me, I'm definitely having to think about how I move on that other swing back from an amazing intellectual, all perfectly conceptualized faith into something in which we genuinely encounter God and know that God is here. what should be done then, my friends? When you come together, each one, I've mentioned that probably doesn't mean every single person, but kind of anyone has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation. That's the great word. A pop means an unveiling. It means that we suddenly see things differently. We see what God is up to in a situation that we can't necessarily understand. A tongue or an interpretation. Sorry to repeat it, let all things be done for building up. If anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be only 2 or at most 3, and each in turn. Let one interpret. But if there's no one to interpret, let them be silent in church and speak to themselves and to God. So Greek is a bit complicated. It may be that if you have a prayer in tongues that you want to share, it might be that you can then say, you might be the interpreter. You might not necessarily have to wait for someone. Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the other what is said. Every time Paul talks practically about prophecy, it's not something that just sort of falls to the floor and you go, oh, a prophecy, and then walk away. The responsibility of the community to take it seriously enough to say, yes, this is God speaking, or no, this isn't God speaking. It's not for entertainment. Building others up is not about a warm feeling. It's about building the community, making that body work. If a revelation is made to someone else sitting nearby, let the first person be silent. So you give way to another person who wants to share, for you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all be encouraged. And the spirits of prophets affect to the prophets. For God is a God not of disorder, chaos, decay, but of peace. So I don't know what you're thinking about in terms of how this church is meeting. People are able to bring all kinds of contributions. I'd love us to think about how we do this, maybe practice in our house meetings first, in our small groups, how people can bring whatever it is that God has been teaching them over a week, or just bringing a song that they love to sing. I think that's where Paul wants us. God can enter into the meeting through anyone. It's not channeled through those of us who stand at the front. God, we're waiting for God to speak, and it could come from any corner of the room. But here, as I say, this group is at the other end of the pendulum swing. He's saying, let's bring some order to this, because it will be more of a blessing if people speak in turn, if we're not all talking over each other. Just structure your meeting to be the greatest blessing. But he's assuming that everyone is turning up with something that they want to share. So for me as a leader, there's a challenge for how we make more room for God, and that's why I'm about to stop talking. For you as someone who might see yourself, you might even use the language of going to church or attending church. You are church. We are church. And for each of us, the question is, what am I bringing? How am I going to build up this community? This has been a good gathering if I feel I've been able to build others up. Just the last few verses. Anyone who claims to be a prophet or to have spiritual powers must acknowledge that what I'm writing to you is a command of the Lord. Now, we know that elsewhere Paul says, oh, this is just my view. He doesn't think this about what he's just been saying. Anyone who does not recognize this is not to be recognized. He uses that formulation a few times in the letter. If you do not do this, then it's not reciprocated to you. So for those of us that are called to leadership, we have a role in recognizing spiritual gifts. We have a responsibility to say, you are not building up body. It's a tough responsibility sometimes, being a leader, to have to say that to someone that you know and love. So, my friends, be eager to prophesy, and do not forbid speaking in tongues. You can imagine that they're arguing about, well, you know, blah, 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 blah. If it makes no sense, why do it at all? He's saying, don't forbid speaking in tongues, but all things should be done decently and in order. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking there, because we've just had the magic message that we've got 5 minutes left. So what I want to do now, just for 5 minutes, is take the opportunity to make room for the Spirit. And then when we go back, we will share. And if you would like an opportunity to spend more time listening to the Spirit and sharing what the Spirit is up to, we will try to manufacture a group for folk that would like to do that.